Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today, our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S to C tier for patch 1024. Before we get started with the tier list, it should be noted that a hotfix patch was released. It's a bit too early to tell how this will affect the meta, so we'll be going based on how the meta has formed so far in 1024. But it does mean that there may be a shift in the meta once players have had time to explore the changes. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To start off, we have the S tier synergies, which consists of Cultist, Shade, Adept, Mystic, and Tormented. These are the best performing synergies for 1024 and the ones you're most likely going to see at the top of lobbies. At the head of S tier, we have Cultists. Before we talk about what made this synergy so good, it does first need to be pointed out that the trait did receive a nerf in the hotfix. Galio's health and attack damage were lowered, so this may end up affecting how strong Cultists are for the rest of 1024. But let's get back to what made this trait so good thus far. For starters, it's a safe synergy to lean on from the early game to the mid game. Playing it basically guarantees you either to win rounds during those stages of the game, or at least you won't lose much health. Specifically, if you're able to find a chosen cultist and hit 6 cultists early enough, you can often coast your way to level 8 while remaining at a relatively high health. Besides the reliability it provides early on in the game, it also has a flexible late game. Whether you choose to continue on with the trait itself to go to 9 cultists or use it to transition into a different build at level 8. Whichever way you choose to play cultists, it's proven itself to be the best overall trait for 1024. Next, we have Shade, which may also end up being affected by the hotfix patch. It's no secret Zed has been overperforming in the current meta, so they've scaled back his attack speed and attack damage steal of his ability. We'll have to wait and see how well this does moving forward. Back to Shade. Shade is mainly doing well because of Zed, but also Kayn, as Kayn is a top legendary champion in the late game. As for the trait itself, it provides backline access, and the invisible effect makes it so champions drop aggro when targeting a Shade champion. This makes Zed difficult to deal with for a lot of comps. Put all those factors together and you have a synergy doing quite well, though it is definitely carried by Zed. Our next two synergies are staples of S tier, with Adept and Mystic being the best splash traits in the game. Mystic, as usual, is important because there's just so much magic damage in the current meta, especially with Talon no longer being a threat. Adept, on the other hand, relies on its champions to do well, although the attack speed slow is definitely still good. But Shen, Aurelia, and Yone are all highly valuable champions. Especially Yone, who, before the hotfix changes, has been a top late game unit in the meta. And for the last synergy in S tier, we have Tormented. We've already talked about how well Kayn is doing in the meta, and the Tormented trait just augments that even further. Both blue and red Kayn are viable, though the extra damage generally helps the most, especially since it's common to end up with slightly more defensive items in the late game. But as we've said, Kayn is one of the best late game champions alongside of Yone, so expect to see him contested quite heavily. Let's move on to the A tier synergies, which consists of Dusk, Keeper, Ninja, Exile, Sharpshooter, Assassin, Hunter, Divine, and Elderwood. These traits are doing above average in the meta and consistently end up in the top 4 compositions. Up first is Dusk. Dusk is just an all-around solid trait that almost always has a place in the meta. Whether it's 6 Dusk or just splashing in 2, you're likely to see 1 or 2 players in the trait every single lobby. Besides the fact that Riven is a great carry and you get to strong defensive champions like Thresh and Cassiopeia, Dusk is also one of the best traits to use a spatula for. This is because the ability power is useful for every champion, especially 5-cost units like Kayn or Yone. Next is Keeper. Keeper was nerfed slightly in the hotfix, but is likely to still do well, at least early game, as the shielding is hard to break through with smaller amounts of units. Plus, a lot of champions are just good in the meta currently, between Riven with Dusk, Elise with Cultist, and Jarvan just being all around very good. Ninja gets a spot at the top of A tier mainly because of Zed. Besides Zed, Shen is still highly contested as a frontliner and adept. Kennen finds use in Keeper compositions, and well, Akali is okay early on in the game. But all of that pales in comparison to the impact that Zed has had on the current meta, so consider this trait more Zed and his ninja friends. Exile is doing well because Yone is such a ridiculously good late game champion. Of course, Yasuo is also doing okay in the meta with Duelist, although his impact has felt more early on in the game than anything. But because Yone is doing so well, Exile gets a huge increase in value. Again, keep in mind Yone was nerfed, so he may not be as strong as he has been in 1024. Sharpshooters sneak into the middle of the A tier pack due to the strength of Jhin. There's a lack of strong range damage dealers, and Jhin fills that role well, especially since he's playable in multiple builds like Sharpshooters, Cultist, and Dusk. So if you want a strong range carry, look for Jhin too. Next, we have Assassin. Assassins aren't necessarily that great right now, but they are carried by a few champions, mainly Pyke and Diana. Pyke is a core champion for early to mid-game cultists, and Diana has her place in a Moonlight reroll build. In addition to them, you're going to see Assassin played alongside Ninja just to make Akali a bit more of a threat, as well as in Warlord to help Katarina carry. It's definitely not as scary of a synergy anymore with Talon out of the picture, but it's still good enough to be in the A tier. Hunter is definitely struggling right now, as Ashe isn't as good as she was in previous metas, but she's still a carry you can lean on for a top 4 placement. Warwick is also having a resurgence with Divine, so you can play him alongside Ashe for a pretty strong pair of champions. As for committing to a full Hunter build, you may not see that as often anymore, though Chosen Hunter Warwick or Ashe can be devastatingly good. Since we mentioned it, up next is Divine. Divine isn't necessarily doing better in 1024, but it is being carried up in the rankings because of Warwick. Since Warwick's ability now boosts the attack speed of any champion he shares a trait with, it's really upped the damage factor that Divine does, meaning that you can play Divine as an actual 4 or 6 piece trait again. And the last trait in the A tier is Elderwood. Elderwood really isn't doing much other than being there to assist Ashe and later on Ezreal. It's an okay defensive trait that provides a decent early to mid game frontline, but it does often get outscaled in the late game, so you'll mainly see it make Ashe or Ezreal slightly harder to kill. Time for synergies in B tier, which consists of Duelist, Moonlight, Warlord, Dazzler, Brawler, The Boss, Fortune, and Enlightened. These synergies are average at best and often situational depending on the right conditions. Our first 2 B tier traits are Duelist and Moonlight, as they both are used in reroll compositions. Duelists lean on Yasuo 3 as the carry with the goal of adding in late game champions like Lee Sin and Yone. Moonlight, on the other hand, is all about Diana, as you want to find her as a chosen Moonlight. After that, you 3-star both her and Lissandra to gain access to Diana 4. Both of these synergies are primarily used for their reroll builds, although Duelist has a bit more prominence in the meta since it does well early game. But overall, they are meant to be played in reroll builds, and that's about it. There are times that Warlords can do well, and in fact they are a top composition in the meta, but the synergy itself struggles if you aren't hard committing to it. 6 Warlords with a bunch of 3-star champions and legendaries can do well, or the much harder to play 9 Warlord, but outside of that, it's really not a synergy you can splash in and do well with. Even early game, it can struggle. So while it is part of a meta composition, Warlord as a whole is still just an average trait. Dazzler definitely took a hit in 1024 with Enlightened falling out of the meta, but it's still a strong splash trait, especially late game with Ezreal. That said, you may find it hard to fit this synergy in, since it's less useful than Adept or Mystic as far as splash traits go. Brawlers aren't bad, at least in the early game and into the mid game, but they really don't fit into many compositions past those stages of the game. At best, you're going to see them in an Ashe Hunter comp, or maybe a second Brawler to pair with Hunter. Most of the time, you'll see this trait used early on in the game, and that's about it. The Boss is right below Brawlers, mainly because Set does rely on the Brawler trait both for survivability and for damage. So when Brawlers aren't doing that well, Set tends to not do well either. With that said, he's still a decent 5-cost champion late game. When you can 2-star him, it's just hard to find a place in your composition to fit him in. Next, we have Fortune. Fortune can be amazing, but it's a gamble. Because it's a gamble, that means the pace of the game matters a lot for how good this is in the meta, and after the damage changes to 1024, it can be a bit difficult to make Fortune pay out worth it. But if you can get Fortune early enough in the game, it's definitely valuable to play, so there are times it's going to do well. All in all, Fortune is a player-to-player decision, so if you're willing to take the risk, go for it. And the last B-tier synergy is Enlightened. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Okay, maybe it's not that dramatic because Enlightened still has great champions like Aurelia and Janna, but oh man, did it fall off in priority with Talon getting gutted this patch. Plus, the Nami bubble build isn't doing anywhere near as well as it was, so there's even less reason to run Enlightened. but there is a place for Enlightened between Aurelia, Janna, and occasionally Morgana, so it's not all doom and gloom for this synergy. On to the last tier for today, the C tier. This tier consists of Vanguard, Spirit, Mage, and Emperor. Honestly, there's no truly bad synergy in the game right now, but the ones in the C tier are definitely not as useful as the other ones in other tiers. First up is Vanguard. It's painful to put Vanguard down in C tier, but what does this synergy really provide? Armor? Great. Let's see how this armor does against all of the magic damage in the current meta. While we're being a bit harsh, it's true. The armor Vanguard gets only matters early on in the game, and beyond that, it won't add much, especially with Vanguard Mystic Ahri build not doing that well. With that said, it should be made clear that the Vanguard champions are great, but the trait, not so much. At least not in the current meta. Spirit, unfortunately, just doesn't matter right now in the meta. Ahri is still played, but much less than she used to be, and the Spirit buff really doesn't provide enough right now. Even the main user of it in the past, Zed, has found new ways to shine in the meta, but Spirit is still floundering around without a real purpose. They'll definitely need to overhaul this synergy to make it relevant again. Mage is a lot like Spirit, as it just doesn't have a place in the current meta, especially with Ahri not being as good as she was. Heck, even when Ahri was good, she really didn't use Mage anyway. And with Nami not doing well after some nerfs, well, there isn't much hope for Mage now beyond high-rolling Zillion 2 with a Mage hat and a Lilia. And as usual, our last synergy on the list is Emperor. As we usually state, this isn't a bad synergy, and Azir is actually an amazing champion. But it's just such a lackluster trait to have on a legendary champion that even if it's useful, it's just boring. Considering Azir has continuously been a top meta champion, we'll likely be raising this trait in the future tier list, but for now we'll keep it down here just because it's so bland. That's all we have for today's tier list video. The hotfix may end up changing parts of the meta, but in general expect to see what has been working to continue working, especially for traits like Adept or Mystic that are universally useful. Let us know in the comment section below what synergies you think deserve to be higher or lower on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.